Hello, welcome to your October fertilizer market update. My name is Ashley Buer with the Andersons. We'll start things off with nitrogen. So there's several themes that are influencing the broader nitrogen fertilizer market right now, and this is going to largely apply to the ammonia market, the urea market, and the UAN market. And so I'll touch on those here, and then we can go into a little bit greater detail as we work through these slides, but generally, tight supply. Deferred demand. Notice I said deferred, not destroyed. That demand is still expected to be there, just kicking that can down the road a little bit, at least here domestically. We saw really low ending stocks as we concluded the 2024 fertilizer year. And we've seen just a few production hiccups along the way, just enough to keep that available supply a little snugger than what is comfortable. On top of all of that, we're seeing some decent export activity out of our US market, and we're seeing really slow imports making their way into the US market. So all of that is adding up to a generally bullish sentiment across the nitrogen fertilizer complex here. And we saw that here when the Tampa ammonia contract just settled for October at $30 a ton, a metric ton, higher than September, continuing that month over month over month of ammonia price increases here. Of course, that's going to have influence in the urea and UAN market and be supportive of some higher prices there as well. But of all of the fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers specifically, urea is particularly tightly supplied. And again, this goes back to what we've kind of been talking about now for several months, and China is still not exporting urea. Historically, China has been the largest exporter of urea into the global market. And with them still sitting on the sidelines, it's made for some pretty tight inventories. Now, India is starting to get a little bit behind on their urea purchases. The most recent Indian tender just concluded October 3rd, and it ended up with a total of 2.6 million metric tons being offered for that tender. This is less than what was generally expected, and is actually the smallest volume of urea in an Indian tender since 2022. And so that has certainly given some renewed concern to the urea market. Of course, we have these escalating tensions in the Middle East as well. And of course, if you're unaware, the Middle East is a huge producer of nitrogen fertilizer. And historically, they've been able to do that relatively cheap because of their easy access to cheap and reliable sources of fuel. But today, we're seeing those tensions escalate. It's making barge rates increase. So even if they have cheap fuel, cheap production costs, they are seeing a rise in cost simply to get a barge loaded and into the market. And that's really working together to drive this urea market a little bit higher. And that is supportive of a higher UAN market as well. Now here domestically, our natural gas prices have been really affordable, hanging out right around that like $2 an MMBTU, and even less for in the Canadian market. While Europe has stabilized right around that $11 an MMBTU. Essentially what this means is that the remaining 25% of nitrogen production that remains offline in Europe isn't likely to come back online either. And so that creates increased demand and less available product, of course. With our lower natural gas prices here in North America, it's been a very good incentive for domestic manufacturers to export their nitrogen fertilizers into that European market, which is exactly what we're seeing. It's also helped limit imports coming into the US market so far. So looking here at this, this is a nitrogen price relative to ammonia. So that red line would essentially be your base cost. That's your ammonia cost. Your blue line would be urea. Your black line is UAN. Now, Typically, there's somewhere around a 25-30 cent premium between urea and UAN, with UAN being a little bit more expensive on a cost per pound of nitrogen. Today, they're pretty darn close. What this would suggest is that there is either an opportunity for urea to get cheaper or for UAN to get more expensive. Given what I just shared, the likelihood would be for UAN to get more expensive. And I realize that none of us want to hear that. And we're all going to say, but what about the corn market? Absolutely. The relationship between the grain market and the nitrogen fertilizer has to be a factor in all of this. But today, if we look at where things are at historically, there's an opportunity for things to change here. Looking at the corn and UAN barter rate, right? That's just what we were talking about, is that relationship between the corn market and the cost of UAN. Uh, it's not what we would like to see, but it's better than it was this time last year. It's hanging out right there in that historic range that we use as kind of a benchmark to compare current relationships. I'm going to jump right back there because I want to make sure that I highlight one other thing here. It, Given that we've seen this kind of lack of demand here domestically, I want to underscore that that isn't expected to have been destroyed demand. What the general expectation is today is that that demand is just getting kicked down the road a little further, which we've gotten really good at doing here. It's become a bit of a habit over this last year or two, and it sometimes works out okay. But more often than not, what it creates is these kind of localized areas that we see a huge price increase, and that's really the biggest risk today on a pricing and availability front, is these decisions that aren't getting committed to or are not getting made today are all going to show up at the same time. And of course, that is going to mean that there's limited product available, and that product is going to cost more at the end of the day here. Okay. On to the phosphate market, which is not going to necessarily bring us a lot of relief in terms of good news, but I don't think that's going to surprise anyone either. It's been a long story of tight supplies on phosphate. We can go back to the countervailing duties that were applied against Morocco, especially, who had historically been one of our largest suppliers, but also Russia. Uh, and what we're seeing right now is a very tight supply here domestically. We're seeing some elevated prices kind of across the globe, however, and a lot of that is going to likely continue for the foreseeable future here. So right now we're looking at India is in need of buying some additional DAP. They're fairly far behind at this point on covering their DAP needs, and that's going to help keep this global sentiment fairly bullish. Long term, though, again, higher phosphate prices appear to be likely to remain here for the coming season. That's just the way it's going to be for right now. Going forward, there is the imminent threat here of Hurricane Milton, which we'll touch on in just a second, as Florida braces for impact against their second hurricane here in just a couple of weeks. And that could have some more localized consequences here for the US market as well. If we look here at the NOLA map prices here, the relationship between the grain market and the phosphate fertilizer market is probably the bigger story here. It's not that we've seen a run up in prices, it's that the price is high relative to the grain market and it's staying there. So why does hurricane activity in Florida matter to our phosphate conversation? Well, if you aren't aware, 80% of our domestic phosphate production occurs in Florida, and specifically right in that Tampa Bay area. So Tampa and as you move further inland and just north and south of that Tampa area is where the predominant amount of phosphate production there in Florida occurs. And of course, that is exactly where Hurricane Milton appears to be headed. Now, we did just hear from Mosaic and from Nutrien that following Hurricane Helene, they were kind of concluding or working through their cleanup efforts. There hadn't been significant damage to their facilities. and which was great news. But here, as we move through this week, we'll know more about the impact from Hurricane Milton. It's currently Category 5, may downgrade to a Category 4 by the time it makes landfall, but it's a very large storm. So significant portion of Florida is going to experience the impacts from this hurricane. And not only is it the facilities that face damage, but more importantly, the workforce, the individuals who are there in Florida, they're really facing a tremendous challenge, even by Floridian standards, as this hurricane gets closer and closer. So, uh, looking at the barter rates, there's really nothing particularly good I can highlight here. It's a terrible relationship, right? That red line being the 2025 year here. We are way north of our historic average, and again, it's not necessarily because we've seen even higher phosphate costs than what we had been seeing for the last 2 years now. It's that relationship to the grain market is what is struggling. So as corn has gotten cheaper, the phosphate fertilizer has not. Same with soybeans. So potash has been fairly uneventful. It's generally considered quite well supplied, and the price hasn't shown much volatility whatsoever. And so as we move through the fall application window here, we should have pretty decent supplies now. I will give credit where credit is due. A large part of that was because of manufacturers and distributors taking a position early on in the fall, especially ahead of that Canadian rail strike that was looming. Several manufacturers made a pretty decent push to get product in position. Now, of course, that was very quickly resolved, but given that we are experiencing some pretty wonderful fall weather, we have a forecast for most of the Corn Belt that is very favorable going forward, and harvest activity is just a little bit ahead of historic trends. Hopefully, we are all in a position to take advantage of this wonderful weather and what a gift that actually is. Now, there was a couple of mines in Saskatchewan of mosaics that they were struggling with production, and so they're actually behind on fulfilling their Q3 commitments. And it's likely going to be well into the month of October here by the sounds of it before those tons all get shipped. But if you haven't already made a plan for your fall fertilizer application, certainly get in touch with your Anderson's rep as soon as you can here so we can make a plan, not only to make sure that the potash is available, but all of your dry fertilizer needs for fall application are in place so that nothing is preventing anyone from taking advantage of this wonderful fall weather. And so here's that relationship with corn. It Potash continues to be the bargain buy, I suppose, the best buy, uh, compared to the other fertilizer options. Nothing new there. And there's a very similar story with the relationship to soybeans and potash as well. So now the reality is we wouldn't be surprised to see a bit of demand destruction, not because potash is priced too high necessarily, but simply because farmers are going to be faced with the challenges of lowering their input cost in the face of these lower grain prices. And potash is one area, especially after phosphates, that will likely see some of that hit. And so despite being priced, relatively reasonably compared to everything else, still likely to see a little bit of demand destruction. Which really doesn't add up here to a story that would suggest any likelihood of massive price increases here going forward, given what we know today at least, right? So with that, I appreciate your time. Thank you, and reach out if you have any questions. We look forward to seeing you again for your November update. Thank you.